Hi, everybody. It's lovely to see so many folks here and to see your faces as well. I'm Sally Clegg, and I will be talking about my work today. I want to thank Faith first for inviting me here, and Professors Wainwright and Nowinski as well. I'm very excited to be spending the next hour or so with you. I guess I'd say my favorite part about this type of experience is the questions part. So I'm hoping that folks have questions and that we get to have a bit of discussion. And yeah, I'm looking forward to that. But I can start by giving a little bit of background about myself. I consider myself a multidisciplinary artist. I'm from Pelham, a tiny town right by Amherst in Massachusetts. I did my MFA in interdisciplinary art at the University of Michigan, and I now live in Michigan and teach here as well. And this is where I work on my own artwork and practice. I work in installation, video, sculpture, and in 2D, but non-toxic printmaking and specifically etching is a foundational component of my art practice. Even though I'm far away, I'm a member artist at ZMA's Printmaking in Florence, Mass. And some more info about different opportunities that I've had to share my work in special collections and the Massachusetts Cultural Council Fellowship as well. And I won't read through all of that, but I'm now teaching at U of M in a number of different fields. My work is an investigation of autonomy, subjectivity, and private experience. I'm curious how individuals seek and feel intimacy, connection, and comfort. And my goal as an artist is to bear witness to private, protected, or otherwise invisible experiences or forces. By utilizing the technical and metaphorical potential of printmaking substrates or plates and processes, particularly the manipulation of surface through etching techniques and the printing of multiples, I attempt to capture and make permanent fleeting mental images, personal symbols, and residues of past experience.
So do you want me to start with the first slide?
Sure, yes, that sounds great. The text on each of the slides is in part so that when this virtual show is experienced without the luxury of like the presentation format, it kind of has a narrative to it and takes you through a little bit of my thinking. So I'm not going to read this text, but I'm going to talk about each piece a little bit. This is the first one that I have here. It's called Riddle. It's from 2017. And I want to start off by saying that, like, as an artist with an interdisciplinary practice, moving between different mediums can feel sometimes untethered. This virtual exhibition and this talk is really going to center on printmaking, which is very much an anchor for me in my art practice. I come back to printmaking at points where I feel ungrounded. I might be working in, video 1 month and installation and sculpture the next. But my printmaking practice is like, that's my heart, sort of, to put it in a little bit of an emotional terms. But it keeps me like really rooted in my art practice, and it means a lot to me. So what we're going to look at are some prints from the past 7 years. And this first one is called Riddle, and I intended it as a visual riddle. Following a chain of mental images, drew and etched them into a copper plate and inked and printed it onto damp paper. As you know, I know a lot of you are in printmaking courses right now. I love about etching that it lets you work in tiny, tiny details. And I love the kind of the material quality of the etched line. So that's something that I seek to embrace in every kind of hard ground etching that I make. This second print is called Appaloosa. It's also a hard ground etching with aquatint. And a lot of the prints that I make are, they could be called one-offs or whims. I don't interrogate like the research or the content behind my work in printmaking. I try to let them be what they are. And in that way, that connects to what I think I was sort of trying to say about this being like my heart medium. I let myself do whatever it is that's in my head without questioning it too much. And that was certainly the case with this print called Appaloosa, which is very, very small. It's a large edition. For me, it's a large edition, which means, you know, something like 30 in the edition. And I use it as almost like a small talisman. I give these out, I gift them to people. I love the kind of the quality of working in printmaking in multiples that lets you take an image or an idea or a small whim, a visual prayer, as I called it, and kind of distribute it out to a number of people. So that's what I do with this. I have a stack of these and I give them as gifts, essentially. This next one is called Tub One. When I was making this print, I was at ZMA's and I was working on it, and a visitor came into the studio and looked at this this print, which was at that point in process, and said, I think like George Bush made a painting exactly like that. And it was true. He had made like a painting of his feet in the bathtub, which at first I was like a little bit, I was worried, and I thought like, oh no, this is such a trope. And of course it is, but at the same time, I came to sort of embrace that and like it. I like the things that are a little bit maybe predictable or trite. I don't think that makes them invalid images or ideas. And I think we've all looked down at our legs in the bathtub and thought like, oh, that would make an interesting painting or photograph, and so on. So I included this here in part for that reason. And again, I do attach that to my love of printmaking, and the potential that printmaking has to embrace this quality of, I would say, like supplementarity, which is historically is sometimes positioned as like secondary to a more quote unquote totalizing medium like painting, which is, you know, I think something that I think is actually an asset to printmaking and an exciting area for potential to be embraced.
So I'd like to ask a question, if that's okay, just for the students. I know you talk about working out of your head. Do you also find that working with a sketchbook or jotting down ideas, that sometimes that can be a way to give you an avenue into the prints that you're working on?
Definitely. Yes, definitely. And that, I think that's so important. Just having places to record those ideas when they come up. So I keep notebooks and sketchbooks. So I'll sketch with words, I'll jot down an idea, and I will also sketch with images. There's a lot of drawing that goes into the early stages of making these prints, for the most part. And it's interesting that there are very kind of, as most of you probably know, there are some straightforward ways to transfer a drawing onto a substrate or plate and to create a print. But that was actually something that I didn't really learn or realize until like pretty far along in my work as a printmaker. So I would try to find like workarounds, or instead of transferring a drawing onto a plate, try to recreate the drawing on the plate. Like, it wasn't intentional, but it had some funky effects, but that I can look back on now and say, oh, wow, I know now how I would have been able to do that in a more straightforward way and following a procedure. But a lot of my printmaking education happened by piecing together. Like, I didn't have a a printmaking program where I went for undergrad. So I was self-taught in some areas and piecing together different pieces of information and missing others. But yes, all of that is a very long-winded way of saying absolutely sketching, recording thoughts and ideas really without judgment, just getting things down is so important. So yeah, thank you for that question. This is called Jennifer. This is almost 7 inches by 7 inches square etching, another image that I had in my head. And when this happens again, I will sketch it. And then I will, without, in a lot of these, most of these, without hesitation, just start the process of making the print. And something that I'll touch on with this one that does come up in others as well is that part of that whim or that idea, like, oh, I want to make an etching of this. I'm thinking about the line quality of etching. So I try to connect the sketching stage to the type of print that it's going to be. And that for that reason, like I'm very, very attracted to etching and intaglio because you can get these heavy lines that they're three-dimensional. Like if I ran my fingernail over this print, it would stop on the lines because there are like these channels of ink that really sit on the paper. And then the much, much finer lines, like the lines that make the fur on the cats or the stripes on Jennifer's outfit are very quick, like 5-second etches. And very, very light and delicate in a way that I can't achieve using a pencil or a micron pen. And again, the certain qualities that I love about this medium. Yeah.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
I was really interested in this image, which I'm familiar with and was nice to see. So I had a couple questions. One is just sort of piggybacking off of what you were just talking about in terms of drawing and kind of following an intuitive process. So would you consider this kind of like an immediate drawing? So, or would you work and kind of editorialize as you transfer, or, edit as you go transfer to the plate itself? Do you know what I mean? Like, because you said you're working from an image in your head and not questioning it very much, but if you're prepping drawings, I'm just curious about that process.
Yeah. Yes. Sometimes it doesn't go in such a linear way, like an idea and then a sketch and then the print preparation. Sometimes it's, with this one specifically, I was drawing cats, and then I had the idea for her surrounded by these cats, and I pulled something that I liked. I can't remember, but maybe like one of their faces or the legs, and then I would sort of harvest that from the sketch and do another iteration of it. So there is an iterative quality to it, and a little bit bigger picture. The stringent and technical and really sometimes unforgiving aspects of the printmaking process itself really like serves to rein in the randomness and whimsy that happens in my head and in my sketchbook. So I'm like sort of channeling from that like totally nebulous place into this very precise process, and that helps me put everything into a container in the final work. Yeah.
I think that makes a lot of sense. It's just, I think it's really good to hear about, how people work in terms of process and how, imagery comes about. And this particular one feels like a scene that came out of some kind of larger narrative, not necessarily a linear one, but kind of a snippet of kind of like what happened here. And there's just so many questions that emerge from the image, and it feels like it comes out of that, maybe those different planning pieces, and like that's what happened to sort of create this scene.
Definitely.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
So usually when you make these prints, do you usually go with your first one, are there a lot of ones that you make that you're going for? Like, for example, this one, is there like one way you do it and you don't like it and you retry the same way, or do you switch it up? Or do you usually go with the first one that you like or that you do?
Yeah, great question too. I would say that I switch it up a lot in the drawing phase. At the point where it's going into copper, there's no erasing at that stage. So I try to make sure that I keep that looseness in the sketching and even in the transferring process. And then there are little edits that happen because I know once I put that line, and I love this about Intaglio, like once I incise that line into a plate, there's no getting it out of there. So everything just has to be where it is. And that I think means and leads to and encourages a lot of intention in those like later stages of the planning of the drawing. So that, you know, I ask the question to myself of, why should there be 20 of these in the world? And sometimes I don't always hold myself to that, but the permanence of printmaking and the multiplicity of it, I think lets us or encourages us to kind of ask, you know, why shouldn't it be a drawing? Why should it be a print? Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Do you find it hard to like think of something that hasn't been thought about before? Like if you look at a lot of examples, do you combine them or do you try to like make it as different as everything else? Like is it hard figuring out what to do next?
Yeah. Do you mean everything else, like other people's work or my own?
Yeah.
Other
people's work.
Yeah, I appreciate that question too. I think I used to worry about that all the time, and have this like existential dread that there is nothing that I can do that's new. You know, there are so many people who are doing what I'm doing, but better. I think like that those thoughts can come up, and are totally normal to have as artists. And then at some point, it just stopped. I don't know if I changed or if yeah, I'm not really sure exactly why that stopped happening, but I just kept making my work, you know, like that's the only thing we can do. Just kept making my work. And eventually that thinking just went away and it became, you know, no longer a concern. Yeah.
Jacob, can you mute your mic?
All right, this is called Rabbits 1. As mentioned on the last slide, animals pop up in my work a lot in printmaking. They don't come so much into my work in other media, which I don't know why that is. I really have no explanation for it. But I am very much in love with graphic novels, sort of comic book formats and sequential art forms. I love the way that they manipulate our reading of images. So, you know, we're used to seeing things in sequence, and we're similar to the first print that I shared called Riddle, always trying to make connections between what we're looking at visually and what's happening here. I couldn't tell you. It's something, you know, somewhat sensual with maybe a little bit of ultimate frisbee. And these creatures certainly don't look like rabbits at all. But I love jokes, just to like put it plainly. And I love, this is a very, very small print. I love the idea of somebody like holding this and looking at it and trying to read it and make sense of it. So this is Rabbits 1. Rabbits 2. This was another image from like as I talked about a little bit already, a combination of a whim, a visual that I had in my head, a little bit of sketching, and a little bit of revision, and then just getting it onto a plate. This is another very small print. It's smaller than it appears on your screen, probably. And it's also, there's this something that I've been I remember one of my undergraduate professors criticizing me about in my work was this idea of making things, of being quote unquote precious about your work. And that really sort of hurt and like hit hard. I think that preciousness is a pretty gendered critique too. And I really like at this point, especially in making small prints, embracing that quality of saying like, this is another semi inexplicable image from a whim, and it's small and it's little, and it's maybe, precious, it's pink, but I love the idea of somebody like taking this in their hands and holding it and looking at it and trying to make sense of it. Maybe I'll send him one. So that's rabbits too.
I'd like to ask another question that, with working in etching, and you think about all the different mediums that you can work in as a beginning printmaker, and the fact that when you look at your work, what I've been talking to my students about is how their image really has to be involved with the technique you're using, meaning what medium that you're using to support your image and make it look how you visualize it in your head. Do you find that besides the love of etching and aquatint, which is so beautiful, that you also think about other areas that, wow, my rabbit could go in maybe another format in printmaking, or, your multidisciplinary areas, that you possibly take them and then translate them into other areas that you're working in?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I think that I don't want to create a false dichotomy. I think that I know printmakers who work across like all areas of printmaking and kind of move fluidly between them. I've never been that way. I've always been like pretty hyper focused in my print practice on etching. I think one of the reasons is that I find it very like technically and mentally challenging. I think it's hard in a different way than drawing. And to switch from like intaglio to relief is just a little bit too much. Not that I have worked a bit in relief, but it's a bit too much to turn that, like inverse the thinking. But I do always think, why should this be an etching? So while I tend to stay mostly in my print practice and in intaglio and in etching, I always ask, like, why not a drawing or a painting? And usually the answer has something to do with that, the aquatint specifically, or the line quality. So I can make something smaller than I could with a pencil as an etching. So I'm going to make, like in this print, a cluster of tiny bodies in a way that I wouldn't be able to render if it wasn't an etching, if it wasn't yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Just that I want the students to have patience as they go through learning about the different mediums, that they might like some or less than others. And then when they hit the one that they come upon, the one, I guess is a better way to put it, through the printing technique, how they print it, that then they can apply maybe an imagery that they were thinking about that really matches, meaning that your imagery really matches beautifully with the etching and the aquatint.
Thank you. Yeah, definitely. I think that it's something that we're always doing, and I think it's important to like highlight it too, is figuring out, especially in a situation where you're moving through different print techniques or different mediums in your practice, to like tune into those moments, those little moments of what's delighting you, what seems to fit with your aesthetic, what do you like the smell and the feel of in the studio. Yeah, I think that, and I think that there's like a printmaking medium for everybody. It's a little bit cheesy to say, but if you really like, graphic and like blocks of color, I don't think that way. My brain has a hard time wrapping around that. But if it did, I might make screen prints instead of etchings and so on. So yeah.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you. So this print is called Room 1. This was a very important print for me for multiple reasons. It kicked off a series. It was a big part of my learning, etching the non-toxic way. I had learned a more traditional method in Scotland prior to this. And this was one of the first prints that I made at ZMAs, and it became a series and then a show. And the content of the work is about traumatic memory, hypervigilance, the way that spaces keep residues of the things that happened in them. And this was also kind of a pivotal print for me in turning that idea into an actual like physical practice of how the print is made. So really linking the content with the form of the work. And the way that I did that was by I was taking a lot of bike rides at that time, and I would take this plate with me. It was a copper plate, and I'd put it in a backpack and just go for bike rides on the bike path from Amherst to Belchertown to Northampton and Look Park. And I'm really missing Western Mass. So so I would take it with me, and it would get like dinged up in the process. And then I would go there and record things from those places on the plate into a hard ground that I had put on the plate. And then I'd proof it, and then I'd reground it and take it on another trip. So it wasn't a systematic process that I mapped out beforehand. But that was just the way that I went, and I can see it in retrospect, the meaning of that. And yeah, and so this and the prints that follow are part of that same series.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So you were talking about how you basically took that plate and then it was like getting dinged up in your backpack. Was that like an idea that you had beforehand, or was it like, I'm going to take my plate with me, and then you took it out and it's like, oh, it got dinged, I can use this to, further the work or something like that? Because I know that I've seen a lot of people, even myself, I've taken like kind of like accidents in my work, and not just with printmaking, with pottery and other stuff like that, and then I've like taken it and kind of made it and worked with it, because it, those kind of random acts, like you can never reproduce those, so you kind of have something special when something kind of happens at random. So was it like your intention to do that, or was it kind of like a happy accident?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It was not my intention to do that. For me, at least, I think there's sometimes an expectation that everything is really clear at the beginning, and then you execute it, according to that. Even accidents are supposed to be, and it's easy to, I think, look back in retrospect and talk about it that way. I could tell you that was like something that I'd planned and it was intentional, and it wasn't. It happened, and then well after the fact, I say like, oh, this has a real connection to the content and it's meaningful, and it was accidental, but the next time I do it, it won't be. You can actually borrow and steal from yourself when those things happen, and say like, I could make an entire project that was just without drawing, that is the plates getting dinged up in my backpack. Like you can pull pieces from those accidents, and I think they can turn into even bigger things. So. This is room 2. This is in the spirit of sort of behind the scenes and thinking about that question of accidents and intention and process too. All of these prints were in the stage where I didn't know how to transfer onto the plate, which sounds silly. I completely understand it now. But I was doing these, as I mentioned at the very beginning, these different workarounds to get the visual information that I wanted to onto the copper. This is one of them. It started with this and then the ones that follow. These were not plates that I carried around and recorded on, but they are kind of hybrids of different images. There's my bedding that I took photographs of, and some windows in my apartment at that time. And this process, again, much like we talked about with sketching, it was a different type of sketching, I guess I would say. So I had disposable cameras and I took them around and I recorded these sort of mundane elements of my living space. And then I had them developed, but without the intention of using those as the artwork. It was very much all headed in the direction of making prints. And then I created drawings from those photos and prints from the drawings. Room 3 in the series was I think I left this plate in the ferric chloride by accident. This was another kind of accident. These are very, very deep etches. That was a mistake that I made, but this was also a plate and a point in the process where I was doing things like, instead of trying to get a perfect aquatint spray, just like splashing it on the plate, taking the processes and seeing how that I could push them a little bit to get different effects, different textures, different depths on the etch. And definitely don't recommend leaving your plate in the acid or ferric chloride bath if there are any etchers in the group. It's not good for it, but it happened and it resulted in this piece, Room 3. Room 4, I guess what I'd say with this one is just pertaining to, again, that kind of splash in the background. That's called a coffee lift. And it was another experiment with process. Whatever printmaking medium you're working with, I love about printmaking that because it's so technical and so process oriented, once you get a handle on what the kind of the baseline procedures are, you can mess with them a little bit and build some play into it. And that's what I was trying to do here. So typically a coffee lift is a non-toxic version of something called a sugar lift in traditional etching, where you are, I won't explain it in super in-depth detail, but you're applying actually coffee to the copper plate. And it's a really nice way to get like a crisp, clean shape. Like if I wanted a nice swoop or a circle or a bean or something, I could use the coffee lift process to paint that on the plate and then lift it up through the ground on the plate and be able to aquatint that and turn it into a shape. What I wanted to do was, I guess kind of subvert that way that the process was intended. So what I did was instead I sprayed the coffee on so that instead of lifting up to reveal the clean plate, it could actually be etched in itself as an aquatint. And that's how I created that splash of black in the background.
Can I ask you a quick question, Sally, just about the room series?
Yeah.
You mentioned the first one being really pivotal for you in terms of bringing different things together. And so are all of these, is this whole series sort of doing that, like sort of experimenting to see what the medium can do? Or are they not first? Like, are they sort of firsts in a way?
Yeah, in some ways, each of them is a different first. They all have the same content. It really all was for me about traumatic memory and hypervigilance and my living space. But that had such a close-knit relationship to the processes I was learning. So the first one was the one that started it all and was certainly the most important in some ways. But the others kind of, they each have like a significance to me that has to do with that connection of the process. Because I think that, hypervigilance is a symptom of post-traumatic stress, but hypervigilance was actually quite useful in learning etching because it's so technical, it's so detail oriented, and really like harping on the things that happen on the plate. And the small details and processes was going on in each of these prints. Yeah, does that Does that answer your
Yeah,
question? Okay.
yeah, it's like sort of, it's nice because there's sort of a conceptual and a practical connection there, I think. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. So this is room 6. This came from a drawing. I was like laying on a sheepskin rug. And again, in the spirit of this, like the mundane things around the house, I think that anything that we focus in on really intently can become almost monstrous. And that was what was happening for me with the like the sort of mange of this rug on the floor, and that became drawings. And then throughout the drawing stage with this, I was thinking of like how this will transfer into the etching process, what type of lines it could include. And with this one, what I was learning and teaching myself was how to kind of be a little bit more free with the aquatints so that they weren't completely, contained by the bounds of an object or a line, but actually like move fluidly around them. And using a technique called spit biting was trying like a more painterly application of the ferric chloride or acid onto the plate in order to get a little bit more of a gradient in the grays than a flat gray with a typical way that I would do an aquatint.
Then I wanted to ask a question too that I talk to my students about as well, is that when you work in series, do you find that after, working and developing your work, that maybe a year later, I don't know what time spans to use, but that you actually go back to a series and you say, oh, that's a part of that design that I wanted to work in that print, and then bring it forward into recent work? Because I talk to the students about their visual vocabulary, how it can kind of go away, but then something will come back that will initiate another form in, like your kitty cats, and that they would come back and show up later, revolving around another space that you're trying to investigate at that time. Does that happen to you?
Definitely. Yeah, all the time. I would say that my whole art practice, like across media, is built on that premise, which is experimentation, iteration, and then borrowing from myself. I would say if I ever made any artwork that was like fully complete and contained everything that it needed to say and got the process just right, there would not be an artwork after that. Like, it's almost like there need to be these loose ends, some kind of provisional quality, that there's always something else that you can make after. And I think it goes together with this idea of borrowing from yourself, or making something a mark or a technique or an animal or any kind of imagery that you then pull into something in the future. I do that with my sketchbooks. I do that with this work too. There's always something I think that you can take into the next thing that you do.
Thank you.
I did have one question
Yeah.
about the material. You mentioned pretty often that you use aquatin, but what exactly is it?
Yeah, aquatin is, I'll do my best. It is like a technique in order to get grays, essentially, in etching. So when you're working in etching, whatever copper is exposed on a plate is going to, when you submerge that plate into an acid bath, the acid is going to bite into it, and that's the spot that's going to hold ink. So it's like the opposite of relief printing, where you ink it and the ink sits on whatever is exposed. And with an aquatint, what happens is the spot of copper that is exposed is just like a tiny dot on the plate. So this kind of a spray of tiny dots will ink up and print as a gray or a gradient. Does that answer your question? Okay.
I think so.
Yeah, it's I guess I want to say here too, I love all of the technical elements of the printmaking process. But I also think it's too much for any one, person to store in her brains. And so like the way that I learned it, especially because I didn't get the chance to do it in like a formal context in school, was just to say, I like what I see in this other image. And this was the way that I came to printmaking in general. I think I was looking at lithographs and etchings in galleries and museums, and I thought they were drawings. And I just thought like, oh, that drawing has like a certain quality about it that I really love. And I don't understand what it is. And then I would later learn like, oh, it's a lithograph. That's why it has that visual quality. So I brought that into my own work in my early stages of learning printmaking, was just to look at things that I liked and say like, okay, I see that that's a gradient or that has this certain quality about it. What is that technique and how did they do it? And then just like one little piece at a time, just learn that the thing that I needed to know to do that, rather than gathering all of the information and trying to save it in my mind and store it. There's just a lot of granular detail to it. This and the couple of prints that follow are part of the series called Bundle. And this also follows sort of this theme about sketching or the prep that goes into making a print. And very much for me also relates to this discussion of why something has to be a print versus, or why something would be interesting as a print versus another medium in 2D. This series was about intimacy through objects. So I was thinking about childhood toys or blankets or objects that give us comfort in our lives, and create like a sense of intimacy without interpersonal interaction. So I decided to make an object like that, and it was a soft sculpture made out of nylons and stuffing and different materials that I'd gathered. And that sculptural step was part of the sketching process for this series. I guess I would say I was aware that that was what was happening at the time, but it was also something that started with a whim and just said, I want to make something squishy, and I made it. So I made this sculpture, this soft sculpture. I staged a series of photographs holding it, and then I made drawings, and then I started the process of making etchings. So there were a lot of sketching and lead up stages to the final prints. And after that, an artist book as well, that kind of fed into this process at the print stage. And this was an example of what I was talking about a little bit with technique, and specifically techniques in printmaking or seeing something and wanting to emulate it. The color on this print was using a method called a la poupée, which is just hand inking the plate with different colors, typically to achieve, as you guys know, achieving multiple colors in any print process typically involves adding another plate. It is very labor intensive, and it gives you an appreciation when you see prints that have many different colors of how much material and time and work and added process goes into that. But again, in the spirit of just not being able to wrap my head around that, I decided I wanted to try a la poupée, and all of that involves different colors going onto the same plate, and they sort of blend together, and you use a technique with your hand to combine them and then wipe your plate. So that's the way that the color was applied in this and the prints that follow.
I did want to ask, because I've been explaining to the students about how there's just such a variety of inks that you can use, the water-based inks, the oil-based inks. And is there a certain ink that you found through going through the process that you like? We use a lot of Akua inks and working primarily with them, but explaining about inks is like explaining about different paints and paint suppliers and things like that. Or is there certain inks that you enjoy using?
Yeah, definitely. In my like single-mindedness, although I don't think this is uncommon, I only wanted to work for many years with the proofing ink that I had learned on, which was for these etchings, graphic chemical stiff black. It was familiar to me. Even like a small change to a variable like the ink is significant. You know, my hand didn't know how to work with it. Every element like that, from the weather that day to the humidity and the temperature of your table and all of that can affect the way that a plate wipes. And I had this muscle memory with that ink, so I stuck with that for a long time. I switched to Charbonnel 55981, which I didn't, which was fine. It wiped smoother. But I think like I will always have the tendency to just want to use the thing that I started with. And then for the colors, these are Charbonnel. Charbonnel has a line of water washable inks, which I haven't tried. So these are not those. I forget the name of the series, but I bought just a set of Charbonnel inks in a few different colors, and I've had them for years. Because I use color in such small applications, I don't know if they'll ever run out. They're just small tubes, and I keep those around. But I do, when I've used Akua, I've really loved it as well. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Just another in the series. This is bundle 3 of 4.
Ellie, did you create photographs to work from for these?
I did, yes. So the process went soft sculpture, digital photographs. I'd use disposable camera photographs in the room series. I did digital photographs for these, and then drawings, and then etchings. So yeah.
Was it at all collaborative with the people that you were photographing, or?
It wasn't. I only used myself.
Okay.
So I would use like a tripod and a timer, and those stages of the process I'm typically doing in private, as if it's something, even though, you know, it's not secret at all, but my practice has always been that way. I would sort of wait until the very end to open it up to anybody else. And I've gotten better about that, I think. In grad school, they really can't, that's not an option. But my tendency is to kind of keep everything like secret and then go to the commons of the print studio where there's all these other people around, and that's really the first stage where other folks are in it or seeing what I'm doing.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is the last in the series, or in the group that I put together for this virtual exhibition. This is called Portrait of Lord Auch on the floor of my studio. Lord Auch is the pen name of the French philosopher and writer Georges Bataille. And it's kind of a joke. Bataille has a book called Story of the Eye, which is very graphically pornographic, and there's lots of motifs of bed sheets and eggs in it. And at this point, I was halfway through graduate school. I was very deep in a very, I'd say, dematerialized, which just means like not very making focused, research driven art practice that really was in many ways more about writing research papers, which I say with love, I like writing research papers, than it was about like making art objects. And this was, I wanted to come back to what I said at the beginning about printmaking and specifically etching being my heart medium, something that anchors me. This was a point where I needed to make a print. So my research that I was doing in the academic side of things certainly came into this in the content, but the act of making this print and sitting or just working in the print studio at night during that stage in my grad school experience was just very grounding. So that's I think the last one.
I
Faith.
think it is too.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Amazing. You can just talk about your work, and every single slide you're talking about something totally different. And then you mix it all together in a very unique way. So we really appreciate you being here for our students and faculty. And we'll be putting this on our website so many more can see it. And then I wanted to thank Maggie Nowinski, Professor Nowinski, and Professor Wainwright for being part of this.
Welcome.
So it was very rewarding. It was just nice to sit back and listen to everybody's discussion. And I think the students will take a lot away from this presentation.
Thank you so much for having me, Faith, and Maggie and Jamie as well, and for all of the questions. Yeah, I would be happy to talk more if there, I don't know if we are at time, but I loved all of the questions. So.
Well, if
Thank you.
anyone has any last minute question, we have a few minutes left.
So,
I had a quick question. I was just curious about, so you use non-toxic printmaking techniques, and I was curious, two things. Were you able to continue that when you were in Michigan? And also, does that sort of philosophy of non-toxic materials inform the other materials you use in terms of installation and sculpture and, you know, all of the other mediums that you work in?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. So the non-toxic approach was not something that I started out with. I learned printmaking in Scotland. It was very traditional methods. And I was fully embracing of the toxicity of it. The shop tech in that studio would put nitric acid on his tongue. It was sort of like, it was like associated with machismo, not to wear gloves. You know, it's a personal choice. I'm doing it. I'm dying for my art. And I laugh now. I felt that way. I felt like it was almost cool, which I think I don't mind admitting because I can see how silly that was now. And then kind of fast forward to ZMAs and working in a completely different art making context where I got to work alongside artists who had damage to their health from working for years in certain processes and just thinking wow, it's not cool at all. It matters to me. And I realized that I didn't have trouble adapting my practice to being in a different context and a different studio. I think that was largely because it was so research driven. And so it wasn't so much based on producing art objects, but I did think about that at various stages, working in sculpture and installation, and working with, having not done art school for undergrad, things that were givens in the sculpture studio, like using 20 cans of spray foam in order to achieve something, and saying okay, I'm not going to do that. That is one of the most toxic, noxious and permanent materials I can put into the world. It doesn't feel like it's in integrity for me. So what am I going to do instead? There were a couple of tense moments where there was a gap between wanting to make something and facing the toxicity of the material. I did end up using a lot of silicone, which is not toxic, but it doesn't biodegrade. So that work is going to be here forever. And I think about that. It doesn't always drive the final decision, but it is always on my mind, I think. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question.
So with that, I think we will stop our conversation. But thanks again to everyone. I think this is very worthwhile.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thanks everybody for being here. Yeah, I hope everyone has a great rest of the semester.
You too.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you. Bye.
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 Thank you, Faith.
You're welcome.
Okay, we'll see you again. Bye. Thank you. Bye, Sally. Thank you. Nice to meet you.
Bye, you too.
Love to see your work.
Thank you so much.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Faith, I just wanted to stay and say thank you again for putting this together. I had such a
Sure.
nice time. So,
Well, it was a long time in coming. You were going through all kinds of schooling and getting your degrees and everything, but I'm glad we kept in touch and that it worked out for you. So I'll talk to you via email as soon as the recording's finished and we have it installed into our website, give you the website address, and you can use it as you wish.
great. Perfect. All
And-
right.
Hopefully we see you next year.
Yes. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Great.
Perfect.
Especially after seeing all the prints, and prints photograph so well in this medium. I mean, if you're doing sculpture or something, it's totally different because you need that presence of space. But the prints, I think, worked out beautifully. But to see the work in person and then the detail on those tiny little pieces, that was incredible because I never think of
you.
working that small. And
Thank you.
but yet it had so much integrity.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I really appreciate that. And all of your support. It's just been wonderful. So I guess we'll be in touch. I look forward to that.
Sounds good.
All right. I will head out. Take care and I'll
Okay.
see you later. Bye.
See you later. Bye-bye.